want to talk a little bit about the content of rights. Some of you know the name of the Helsinki Conference or the Helsinki Conference on Rights or stuff like that. It had to do with our interactions with the Russians. I had the occasion to meet an American diplomat who was part of the delegation that had gone over to negotiate certain human rights issues with the Soviets. And he said to me, we really wanted to talk about human rights in the Soviet Union. We'd been briefed. We knew about, I bet you can give me the list even if you had no connections with it whatsoever. Freedom of religion, freedom of press, freedom of speech. We wanted to talk about rights. And he said to me, you know what they wanted to talk about? Which proves how duplicitous they are. They wanted to talk about you can't walk through Central Park at night without getting mugged. They wanted to talk about unemployment. They wanted to talk about people in America who had no health insurance. We came to talk about rights, and they wanted to talk about all of this stuff. That's a true story. It's an example that has stuck with me a long time. What is it that these rights are, and why is my inability to walk through Central Park without getting mugged more or less discussed in the language of rights than my ability to criticize the president if I stand on a platform or something like that? All right, straw poll. Everybody votes, please. How many people in the room believe in Santa Claus? Raise your hand if you believe in Santa Claus. Seeing 4, of which I am 25% of the vote. And the rest of you don't believe in Santa Claus. This Santa Claus you don't believe in wears what color clothing? They all answered. With a beard or clean shaven? What color? He has a particular slogan that he uses. It begins ho. How many hoes? His mode of transportation? Pulled by? How many of you believe in Santa Claus? I mean, you've seen him. You've seen him. Does the toy manager at FAO Schwartz believe in Santa Claus? Does he believe in him in December or in April? Well, he buys in advance, but I mean, in the store window at FAO Schwartz, I hope no one gets sued for this. In the store window at FAO Schwartz, what season of the year do they put the cuddly bunny rabbits? And the fat guy with the beard? I might try out. December, sure. His mode of transportation is by sleigh pulled by reindeer. Do you know the names? On Donner, Dancer, and Prancer, and Donner, and blah, yeah. Now, Rudolph, I needed someone to say, is interesting because Gene Autry, wasn't it? Or Roy Rogers? Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer joins the pantheon of reindeers in our lifetime. In our lifetime. Santa Claus, the song goes, he knows if you've been bad or good, so be good for goodness sake. Do you see the connection between Santa Claus and the Helsinki? But I'm reasonably serious about that. You are used to a certain cultural context in which Christmas has to, whether you are Christians or not, celebrate Christmas or don't, celebrate that aspect of Christmas or don't. You look around you empirically and you say, Santa Claus is Christmas and this is what he looks like and so on, all the examples that I gave. And you need to know that if you want to be able to play the system, right? To manipulate, I mean, you think Hallmark doesn't know? Hallmark knows. There are empirical realities. People treat Santa Claus as if, are you going to let me get away with the language of rights and or values the same way? Or are rights and values significantly different? That meant it's an honest question to which there are multiple answers. So I get up in front of a class of students at Brown University, and I say to them, what is this object? And they say to me, that is a thermal cup filled with cold water. And I say to them, I tell you that it is a cow. And they giggle. And then I say, I tell you that it is a cow. And the student I call upon says, it is not a cow, it is a thermal cup. And I say, on your degree, it is a cow. She says, moo, or something like that. Beauty is in the eye of... That's a cow because I authoritatively, Hobbes, I've got her by her degree, command of the sovereign. We can call it a cow, we can call it a cup. What is it really? On some views, there are coherent answers to that question, which will get us into rights language. On some views, rights are discussed coherently as quote unquote really including this or that or the other thing. Remember the guy who went to the Helsinki conference, as I told you about a minute and a half ago, who really rights are speech, press, religion, not safety on the streets, not getting a job, not health care. Really, or socially defined in a particular context, in a particular social setting, which, to be sure, if you want to manipulate that set, if you want to function better in that society, you need to know the norms and the values of that society. But how far are you prepared to go in your own thinking with our colleagues in anthropology, which is perhaps the most materialist in this sense of the social sciences, our colleagues in anthropology who want to be the proverbial fly on the wall noticing what is going on and not influencing, pure scientific investigation. So the anthropologist on that view notices when he comes to a certain island that they have a certain religious practice in that island that has to do with bringing rains for the crops. Does he believe that that's where we get the rain from? Of course he doesn't believe it. He believes as plausible, someone asked me a question about this during the break, the anthropologist believes as plausible that the way they think on this island will translate or wherever he has come to, will translate itself into a religious attachment to whatever this, the rubbing the idol's belly that makes it rain or whatever. He wants to understand sociologically how does the set of ideas and values operate on that island, how do they change, and just the same way we can talk about Santa Claus. But you don't for a minute want to get into believing Santa Claus. He knows whether you've been bad or good, so he'll know whether I can be on the Supreme Court or not. But there is very coherent sense in which we can talk about Santa Claus. And there is a very coherent sense in which we can talk about law or rights or values as shared and accepted as norms in a particular society. Is that the way to go, and is that enough of the way to go? Let me tell a bad joke that we'll come back to later. I will tell some number of bad jokes. I only identify some of them as bad in the hopes. But here's a joke which works when you're about 8 years old. So if you have an 8-year-old grandson or kid or neighbor, here's a joke you can use on this kid. First kid to the second kid. It is a good thing that your mother named you Billy. Billy. Why? First kid. Because that's what everybody calls you. Now, I think by the time you're about 8 years old or something like that, you can recognize that the joke has it backwards, right? The mother, comma, having called the kid Billy, comma, it's stuck. That is, of course, Thomas Hobbes. The command of the sovereign made it stick. Is there anything inherent about Billy that makes him a Billy? Or intrinsic about Billy? Well, it's a boy's name. Them's fighting words in this society, but that's for later. It's a boy's name. Johnny Cash, the country folk singer, yes. The song I need is A Boy Named Sue. On some antique religious traditions, some of which continue in the present time, names were not arbitrary. Definitions were not arbitrary. On the older traditions, then, if you knew the name of the god, you had power over the god. Leaving religion out of the picture for the moment, in the modern context, as we think about a variety of kinds of issues and about values, how to play it on the Billy joke. Is it that anything that this society comes to view as immoral? Is it that anything that this society comes to view as politically unacceptable is really unacceptable? What kind of a word is this really word? Where does it get us? And how far do you want to ride on that train? I want to run some examples out of my work in the teaching of medical students and get your intuitions and use them to pose a series of problems for further reflection. So the emergency room at the Rhode Island Hospital, which is the dominant trauma center in our community, the emergency room at the Rhode Island Hospital is extremely busy on a Friday night, and a person is brought in with a detachment of the retina. That has to do with the back of the eye, as I dimly understand these things. And the detachment was working from the outside of the retina in towards the optic nerve. The optic nerve had not yet been disconnected. Why does that matter? It matters because the ophthalmologist said that if you could operate before the optic nerve was disconnected, the results could be extremely satisfactory in terms of saving vision. Whereas once the optic nerve had in fact peeled off, as this was explained to me, then the vision would be much less likely to be restored in a meaningful extent. So it was an emergency. All right. So the patient is brought to the hospital. He's got his ophthalmological surgeon. The retina guy is ready to go. The nurses are ready to go. The guy is on the gurney, the push cart, up in the entering the operating room, and all hell breaks loose. A patient had been brought in from Interstate 95, where he had slammed his car into some other things and was hemorrhaging, and they were having trouble typing his blood, and they were trying to get fluids into him, and they were all this. There is a triage rule. You know this notion of triage, making choices under difficult battlefield conditions. There is a triage rule then in effect at the Rhode Island Hospital that a life-saving procedure takes precedence over a vision-saving procedure. A life-saving procedure takes precedence over a vision-saving procedure. So the ophthalmology patient was bumped and was operated on the next day and lived happily ever after, and it was okay. There's no problem. Why might anybody want to have a rule that says a life-threatening procedure takes precedence over a vision-threatening procedure? Well, it seems to avoid making certain kinds of choices. It's automatic. It seems functional. The triage nurse on a Friday night knows how many teams to call in or what to do or how to go. I put to you the following case. Suppose it was the case that the one who was going to go with the ophthalmological problem was Isaac Stern at the age of 11. Clearly destined to be one of the world's great violinists, and he needs his eyes to be a great violinist. And suppose the one who was hemorrhaging with the untyped blood had escaped recently from prison. And in fact, the reason that he got smacked up is that the state police were chasing him with their ugly red things. The state police were chasing him up the highway when he rammed into a lamppost. So here you got the choice, doctor, between saving Isaac Stern's vision, or any, I don't mean to pick on Mr. Stern, any prodigy's vision, and the life of this guy who was a convicted rapist who had escaped from prison and whom the prison guards were chasing. One way out is to have what looks like a content-neutral, remember that phrase from the previous session, a content-neutral rule, which will allow us to know what to do. All lives are more important than anybody's vision. And if you don't like that, how are you going to begin to make the distinctions between the quality of this person's life or the quality of that person's life? To quote a famous source, whose blood is redder than the other one's? How are you going to make that distinction, and who should be entitled to make that distinction? One of the ugliest episodes in American political history was the internment of Japanese Americans in this country in 1941 or so, during the war. Has been in the press 2, 3, 4 years ago on certain issues of compensation. The avowedly racist, and I don't use that language loosely at all, the military general who commanded the West Coast, General DeWitt, who testified before Congress, quote, "The Japanese race is an enemy race and he won't be satisfied till he is stamped off the face of the earth," end of almost verbatim quotation. There was World War II, and the troops, the ships were in the bottom of Pearl Harbor, and Japanese persons of Japanese extraction, including native-born American citizens, including elderly people and children, were removed by law from 4, I think, states of the West Coast, notably California, and were put in what one of the dissenting opinions, when this eventually gets to the Supreme Court, were put in what one of the dissenting opinions in the Supreme Court calls concentration camps. There is much that one could say about the overt racism against Asians on the West Coast. That would be for a more historically oriented lecture than tonight. But my view is it was a pretty grubby thing. So you begin to think through what is it that made it grubby. Well, a lot of people were treated very badly because of their race in a variable over which they had no control. More about that next couple of sessions. Well, it's a little annoying. No, it's terrible to notice that Japanese and persons of Japanese extraction were treated one way in this country, and persons of German and Italian extraction were treated very differently on the East Coast. And there are lots of reasons to think that it was racist and that it was unpleasant and stuff like that. So in Korematsu versus the United States, one of the three cases in which the Supreme Court dealt with these issues after the war was over, essentially, the Korematsu comes down in 45, held the exclusion was constitutional. There are opinions which sort of say, you know, you got to make some judgments, and sometimes you wind up doing things that you don't want to do, and some choices are hard to make, and you can never be sure, and war is hell, and we take chances, and we balance off. That's the phrase that I want for the discussion. We balance off competing claims. There are some judges on that court, Supreme Court in 1945, who want to say it is never acceptable, no matter what, to incarcerate someone purely on the basis of his or her ethnic ancestry. That is a rights view. It is never, there is an absolute right to be treated regardless of one's, independently, autonomously of one's ethnic heritage. And it is not only a rights argument, it is an absolute rights argument. So here's some language that we haven't used yet in this series. Are rights one of the arguments that goes into the balance? One hand up, one hand down, yes? Or do rights, and are rights, for example, considered heavy-duty, heavy-weighted arguments? Or do rights always win? Is there a category, as using race, for example, maybe there are others that you would think about, which are entitled to prevail such that the country would go down the tubes before we would give up those rights? Or come close. So then goes the discussion with the students about, when we discussed this in the 1990s, it is obvious who won the war. So you put yourself back in their time and place. Well, hard to know who won the war. At certain points back there, the fleet was at the bottom of the Pacific. Does it matter? Does it not matter? Why does it matter? Why does it not matter? And you begin doing trade-offs with students. So you pick the student who says it's never appropriate. To digress a second, also worth noting that even up to the end of the war, no person of Japanese extraction was indicted, much less convicted, of any act of sabotage on the West Coast. Before Korematsu was decided, you should know what I just said, which is true, as I have read, that no person of Japanese extraction was indicted, much less convicted, was taken as evidence that a well-coordinated strike was to be expected. You got that? The fact that no one had been caught blowing up railroad tracks or whatever of Asian or signaling to the submarines or anything like that is evidence that it's coming, yes, and they're holding back in a coordinated effort. One of the people who said that was Earl Warren. I don't say that as a cheap shot. Then a politician in California, he may have been governor or he may have been attorney general at the time. He is the source of one of the quotations that the fact that they haven't struck yet is evidence that they will strike. End of historical digression. So a student knows a lot of things like that, and a student finds it easy to say absolute right no matter what, absolute right. So then you say, suppose Japanese submarines had landed on the beaches outside Los Angeles. Can't lock up anyone else except those sailors. Suppose a large number of Japanese sailors had landed. Suppose they had seized Disneyland, which didn't exist then. Suppose, and all you do is begin upping the numbers. Suppose they had captured all of Southern California and were heading north to Berkeley. Still want to say, dear student, that there are absolute rights to be treated as an individual, not as on the basis of membership in a racial or ethnic group, which may never be violated no matter what. The no matter what's, and then you just sort of see when the price is enough for the student and he gets off. He gets off the train. The bad joke that goes with this is a very famous line attributed to George Bernard Shaw, which essentially, who had been at a party, I gather, where he had been insulted by a certain woman, and, Madam, would you sleep with me for 10,000 pounds sterling, which was, I gather, a lot of money when this joke was supposed to have been true. Yes, she would sleep with him for 10,000 pounds. The conversation goes on, and Shaw says to the same woman, would you sleep with me for 1 shilling? Sir, do you take me to be a common prostitute? Madam, that we have already established Now we are haggling about the price. When is it that it's legitimate to haggle in the issues that we're going to deal with here? Speech, press, medical care, other kinds of value issues. When is it legitimate to balance off, to haggle? And when is it that you say there is, if ever, when is it that you want to say not only is there an entitlement, but there is an absolute entitlement, either to something or to be protected against something? Let me put a second case which occurs in university teaching hospitals around where I do my work. There presents a Jehovah's Witness patient for a medical procedure. The Jehovah's Witnesses, as you may know, are a religious sect who hold a view that the eating of blood is prohibited by the Old Testament, and that blood transfusions are included within that definition, even at the result of death. And if a Jehovah's Witness is brought into one of our hospitals, he or she will make clear the concern and ask ask to be treated by conventional Western modern medicine, but not to receive blood products, even if death were to occur. That's a standard Jehovah's Witness case. And I think, I put this for your consideration, I think what many would say is, in the case of an adult competent Jehovah's Witness, one respects that, we can come back and play with that. In the case of a child, I think by now it is relatively easily established that we do not let the parents make a martyr out of the child, and the court will order it a blood transfusion on proper evidence, and the child, when he or she is 18 or whatever, can decide whether she wants to be a Jehovah's Witness or not to be a Jehovah's Witness. A reasonably and a claim by a group to present itself for the treatment of an institution in society, a hospital, with one very significant exception. And they know what their claim is and they know what the consequences might. Hang on to that case. Take a second case. The distinguished academic psychiatrist, Dr. Karl Hammerschlag, has worked in the Southwest for many years with Native American populations. And he writes in one of his books a little two-page vignette about a place called Page, P-A-G-E. That's a place, not people's names. The reservation Navajo near that place, a couple had a child who became acutely ill, as it turned out with meningitis, and brought the child to an Indian faith healer. And the faith healer did a sand painting ceremony. I don't know what that means. But it took 10 or 12 hours to do this ceremony. And then the child was taken to the Indian hospital, National Service Indian Hospital, and was diagnosed with meningitis and was prescribed penicillin, I think, or whatever antibiotic was at that time being used against penicillin. There was very bad relations between the docs and the parents of this very sick child. The docs who heard about the 12-hour delay which might have caused the child his life. The docs, having heard of the 12-hour delay, were openly contemptuous of this superstition and primitiveness and so on and so forth, and argued that, you know, you almost killed this child. Because of the bad interaction, as it is written, the parents took the kid out of the hospital and went back to an Indian faith healer, who the story goes in Dr. Hammerschlag's account, took one look, said get the kid back to a hospital. They brought the kid back to a different hospital at some distance, and the child died shortly thereafter. The physicians were furious with the parents. The physicians said that those parents had essentially killed their child. Dr. Hammerschlag is livid with the physicians who, he said, had they understood the sensibilities of the population that they were there to serve, would have been able perhaps to save this child. Now, you hear the case. You hear the case. Not exactly the same case as on the Jehovah's Witness. Why not? The standard Jehovah's Witness case is different than the Page, I think it's Arizona or New Mexico case. What is the distinction? One of the best titles I ever wrote on anything that I published, not particularly the best article, but the best title. One of the best titles I ever wrote on is something that I published in Stanford Law Review went something like, "It's hard to give instructions to your travel agent where you don't know where you want to go." Thus the discussion of rights this afternoon. Thus the discussion of rights this afternoon. The Navajo who wanted to use traditional folk medicine in addition to to use a pejorative term, but in addition to Western medicine or scientific medicine or conventional Western medicine, in a sense shared the goals of the MD physicians who ultimately treated this child. The MD physician wanted to treat the child. The Navajo parents wanted to treat the child. They wanted to use a procedure which we may consider to be non-efficacious, but their goal of success was to restore health to this child. And there was a disagreement as to the means as between penicillin and a sand painting ceremony. The case of the Jehovah's Witness is different. The Jehovah's Witness in the conventional case presents to the hospital and says, I want to be cured by your medicine. But I have one exception, e.g. I do not ingest blood even by transfusion. And I know that I may well die if I hemorrhage. And I absolve you of that, because my goal with respect to blood products is not better to be saved. My goal with respect to refusing to ingest blood products is to go to heaven. And my goal is it would be very nice to be saved, but salvation is worth more to me than another 50 years in Washington, D.C. So you've got the issue of conflicting values in terms of means. Penicillin cures meningitis. Sand paintings don't cure meningitis. The means to arrive at a cure, and that is one of the places that goals may, that values, I'm sorry, may play out. Or alternatively, we have different goals altogether. You want to cure me, if I were the adult Jehovah's Witness, and I came to you to cure me, but my salvation is more important to me than is your promise of 50 more good years in America. For reflection and consideration, does it matter that there is a variation in goals, the definition of what would be a positive outcome, or does it matter that there is, as distinguished from, is it a distinction that works, a distinction of a variation in goals, in the methods, the values, as to how we get to point X. Having done that, let me tell you yet another Jehovah's Witness case. Extraordinarily powerful case. I was bopping around in somebody's textbook where this case is cited, and I read the first half a paragraph, and I said, another Jehovah's Witness blood case where the hospital had to get an order, see one, see them all. A very wrong attitude on my part, but that is... I begin reading, and I come upon the following, to me, very powerful set of facts. The child is 10 or 12 years old. The child is a grossly deformed young person with a large, ugly growth on his face. The name of the syndrome is von Recklinghausen syndrome. It has a fancy name to, I don't know the fancy name. The movie The Elephant Man, some of you have seen? I have not seen it. I am told that that's what it was. This child has a grotesque deformity such that he does not go to school. That in itself is an interesting issue which dates this case. It was in Dutchess County, New York, upstate New York, in 1970. A little surprising that the child has never been to school. The tumor is not life-threatening, is not vision-threatening, and does not interfere with hearing. But as you would imagine, this grotesquely deformed young person has virtually no social interaction with anyone except his mother, who is a religious Jehovah's Witness. The issue is that the procedure cannot be done without without substantial amounts of blood. Cannot be done without large amounts of blood. The mother will not allow the blood. The issue gets to a court on a theory of child neglect. It is neglect or abuse to not obtain for one's child necessary and proper medical care. And I don't know how this case got itself brought, but the public health authorities in Dutchess County, we'll say, brought a complaint against the mother and seeking injunctive relief to order an operation or to authorize an operation for the child with this deformity. What makes this so interesting and so different from the earlier case presented? The argument typically is life and death. The argument with this von Recklinghausen's kid has nothing, strike that, is not an argument of life and death. It's an argument about the quality of life. This kid, the state is saying, is so grotesque that he will be held in a back room for the rest of his life. There is a procedure that might remedy. There's a lot of stuff about how far the remedy would go and things that are quite beyond our interest this afternoon. The issue is the quality of his life. And it is child neglect to deny this child his opportunity to have this deformity corrected, therein allowing a more normal quality of life. In that case, there is footnoted a case to Washington State, which let me give you very, very quickly, and we'll put the two of them together. There was a case in Washington State at an earlier point where a child apparently was born with or otherwise a grotesque enlargement of the arm. The only way that could be dealt with was by amputation. The risk of death under surgery was apparently very real. The parents made a judgment that it was better to undergo the surgery with the risk of death on the table than to go through, have their child go through life so grotesquely deformed. How did that get to court? The argument was it was child abuse. You got it? In the principal case, the New York State case, the elephant man growth, the court is confronted with a situation in which the parent says, we don't want to do it. And the argument is, it is child neglect. The surgery was authorized. It is child neglect not to risk the child and subject him to this operation. And in the case that is cited in the footnote, the Washington State case, it is suggested that it is child abuse to subject a child to risk of surgery, apparently significant risk of surgery, quote, solely to increase the quality of his life. I mean, it could have lived that way, apparently, for a very long time. Hard to know. I mean, you see what the issues are. Hard to know exactly what should be done. We could get off into a side issue, which I don't want to get into, about children as opposed to adults. And how far may families go and how far must families go in dealing with their children and so on, so on. Quality of life. Acceptable risk. Acceptable risk. Remember 15 minutes ago I held up a paper cup and said, what is this? And we played that game. Are risks really acceptable? Who knows who gets to define in our society that which is an acceptable risk and that which is not an acceptable risk? The vision triage situation, a life-threatening procedure always takes precedence over a vision-threatening procedure, is one way one institution tried to get itself off the horns of this dilemma. They either themselves felt, or indeed historically may never have thought about it at all. It may simply have been a policy that got passed on from generation to generation. I simply don't know. Presumably they all felt that it would be uniformly accepted in this society that a life-threatening procedure always speaks to a more fundamental value than a vision-threatening procedure. And when I then put the case of I tried to get your sympathy with a young violinist as distinct from a mass psychopath that committed rape or whatever he had done. Do you want physicians, do you want emergency room personnel to be making judgments which go, this life is worth saving, that life is less worth saving, this life is still less worth saving, and for that life we'll go to lunch? We'll talk a lot about some of those issues on another occasion. Insofar as you discuss any of these issues, does the language of rights and entitlements help you, or does the language of rights and entitlements get in your way? Professor Dworkin, a well-known writer in jurisprudence, puts an example in one of his books attempting to draw a distinction between public policy making, attempting to draw a distinction between public policy making, the claims of policy and the claims of rights or of entitlements. So Dworkin gives the following case. Consider Lexington Avenue in New York City. Consider Lexington Avenue in a context in which it was a two-way street. The suggestion is then made to turn it into a one-way street. Why was that suggestion made? Well, one-way streets or avenues with the traffic lights set in a certain pattern will get people out of their downtown offices and up to their bedroom suburbs more expeditiously. Who objects to this? Some of the merchants, because this stuff with the stopping the red lights, you pull over, you park, you get into his shop, you spend money. So those are policy considerations. Those are weighing and balancing. The George Bernard Shaw joke. Weighing and balancing. Are there values that we're not allowed to weigh and balance? The detention camps in Korematsu. Or are we haggling about the price? Is there a distinction between a public policy and a principle? Again, is there a distinction between a policy, a utilitarian analysis of how much business will be lost if the cars go that way, how much business will be gained if they can come in two ways, measuring out the cost? Is there a distinction that will work for you between a principle that is always entitled to win, like Trump in bridge, or a set of policy considerations of an essentially utilitarian characteristic? All of this is tied in very strongly to the notion of definitions. That's the game with the paper cup, to the notion of definitions. Definitions. Noted already historically that many issues of rights in the United States are law-related. It's a constitutional right. Leaving completely aside the historical issues that someone wanted to chat about the intent of the framers in the 18th century with respect to fax machines, leaving that discussion completely to the side, there are policy consequences of treating something in the language of constitutional law as opposed to other kinds of law. I suggest for your consideration that one of the dominant issues when we treat something constitutionally, we are really asking to what extent variability will be accepted in the United States. Is X an issue in which different communities can go their own ways and we're comfortable with that, or is X an issue that we require uniformity? For example, there are some states in this country which allow casino gambling. There are other states in this country which don't allow casino gambling. If you played the game of is there a constitutional right, you would be saying the issue of gambling needs to be treated uniformly in every state, as distinct from New Jersey can do what it wants at Atlantic City, and Tennessee can do, or whoever can do whatever it wants in Tennessee. Variability. Prostitution, I have read, only read. Prostitution, I have read, is legal in Nevada. Is that an issue such that it appropriately can be dealt with by each state or even each community within each state? Somebody might want to say that prostitution is so degrading to the woman, assuming that it's the male purchasing female sex, that it ought not be allowed anywhere. Somebody might be prepared to say the opposite. Different strokes for different folks. We need not be uniform across the country on this kind of an issue. Supreme Court in obscenity cases has essentially allowed a localities rule, which means that what is considered to be legally, we'll talk more about this later, legally prohibited in terms of obscenity in some communities need not, the standard in one community need not be the standard in all communities. A judge in Rhode Island put it very pithily at a committee meeting that I was once at, quote, if I can do this right, I don't care what they do in Reno, Nevada, we don't have to allow topless shoeshine girls in Putney, Vermont. What are the aspects of freedom, values, religion, rights in our society that you are prepared to enforce on all of your fellow countrymen, regardless of where they live? And what are the aspects that you are willing to leave to a high degree of variability? I will give you a couple, and you should catch one big one coming down the pike. It is now illegal, I think, federally in the United States to donate organs. To sell organs, I beg your pardon, to sell organs. Transplant types need access to organs. Can I sell a kidney? There is now a federal statute that prevents me from doing that. And I can drag that on for a while. It is legal to sell hair for wigs and things like that. it is or isn't, and it varies, legal to sell rare blood types to the Red Cross. There are a lot of complicated issues involved in the purity of the blood supply. Leaving that aside, it is not only legal but remunerative, I have heard, for in this medical center, which we are close by to, as well as any other. I don't know if this one as well as any other. I don't know. In medical center for sperm donors to be found among young physicians, presumably by potential parents that want genes that have to do with aggression and determination and the capacity to live without sleeping and whatever kind of genes one is looking for. It is legal to donate sperm. You know what's coming next, of course. I got two biggies. Abortion. Is abortion a phenomenon such that it should be treated uniformly in every state of the Union? Or is abortion, and you can be more refined, abortion under certain circumstances, is abortion a phenomenon such that different states should be permitted to differ, to vary in their response to abortion? As you think about that, ask yourself whether the language of rights helps you or whether the language of rights simply becomes the currency in the game, the instrumentality. You need somebody who knows how to make the argument in order to prevail, but you know basically what your own intuition is. The other big one in recent times, complexity of big ones, are alternative methods of procreation. You all remember baby M. So you got a question. You've got a sperm donor and an ovary donor, but it was carried, not an ovary donor, an egg donor, and there was an implantation in the uterus of a second woman, and now the kid comes out. Who is mommy? The same grandma that thought I was crazy talking about rights in the previous class thinks that any 2-year-old kid knows who is mommy. No, any 2-year-old kid knows that it's a good thing your mother called you Billy, because that's what everybody says. If everybody says that the one who carried the egg to viability is the mommy, then that's who we're going to teach the kids, the mommy is. And if everybody does it the other way, that the woman who donated an egg cell is the mommy, then we're going to teach the kids that that's what the mommy is. Who is really the mommy? They all answered with one voice. This time you don't all... And how to function in a society where there is tremendous variability in the significant value issues that are implied in the discussion of new modalities for getting born. Who is the mommy? Who is really the mommy? Some of the views discussed in the previous class, Plato, the Catholic Church, many others, find it coherent and worthy of discussion to talk about who is really the mommy. That, not as to be simple-minded about it, not what one's neighbor says or doesn't say, but the mechanism, at least in the canon law of the Church, of attempting to reconcile or attempting to get guidance out of principles from a body of received wisdom. There are absolutely utilitarian consequences on the other side also. We don't allow gambling because of our judgment that it leads to whatever bad things it is that it leads to. One could listen to an argument like the argument about whether Lexington Avenue should be one way or two ways. The competing claims of the commuters versus the merchants. And one can weigh and balance out in a utilitarian function. Which of those two weigh, and that would be closer certainly to a materialist kind of analysis. How much tax business will the city lose if merchants have to have people drive around the block to come and see them? That kind of question. Definition of death. Definition of death. This class is, you'll excuse me, this class is old enough to remember Boris Karloff? Sure we are. Not my current students. There were all these scary horror movies about being buried alive and when was the Frankenstein's monster really dead and stuff like that. How did you find out if he was alive? Feather under the nose, a mirror to see if there's any breathing. That was the common law's definition of death. Respiration and breathing and heartbeat. Breathing and heartbeat. That is problematic in the modern society, and you have heard, perhaps all of you, maybe read something about, may indeed work with, issues of something called Harvard brain death. Harvard brain death is an oxymoron, right? But you forgive me this cheap shot. Harvard brain death has to do with neurological death. And it's called Harvard brain death because there was a certain conference that was convened at Harvard University, and they dealt there with the issue of when death in fact occurs. The key point you need to know is that the two definitions occur differently in time. You're Harvard brain dead earlier than you would be common law dead, respiration dead, with the assistance of machinery. Right? You can go a long time and yet be Harvard brain dead. Who cares? I will tell you who cares. People waiting for heart transplants and liver transplants and kidney, perhaps less so kidney, but other kinds of organ transplants care very much. Because if you can get the organs, as it has been explained to me, if you can get the organs when they are still being fed with blood spontaneously you will be able, even with a machine rather, you will be able to get a significantly better reaction than otherwise.